our pleasure to hear from a historian and a scholar who has recently written quite a definitive biography of Fethullah Gulen, and through that lens has given us a picture of the Hizmet movement, particularly in terms of the challenges they now face. It's my pleasure to welcome Jon Pahl. And Jon, I want to ask you, first of all, to share it with us. What's the title of your book? What's your understanding of what you've written? And why did you choose to write this book?
Yeah, thank you, Dirk. It's great to be with you, and welcome to everyone who is participating in this event in solidarity with Silence Turkey. So here's a picture of the book. I'll do the silly, commercial thing, but there it is. It's Fethullah Gulen, A Life of Hizmet, Why a Muslim Scholar in Pennsylvania Matters to the World. The content of the book is very straightforward, actually. It is an objective history of his life, the first critical biography in English of Mr. Fethullah Gulen and the movement he has inspired, the global movement he has inspired. Like any good historian, my work seeks to unearth the evidence and work with the details of the evidence of his life and narrate it accurately, fairly, and critically. And so the book tries to undertake that task for English-speaking readers for the first time. The content of the book is organized both chronologically and topically. That is, chronologically from his birth in 1938 in a tiny little village of Korajuk, and then down to his self-imposed exile in the United States. He's been in the US since 1999. And his life followed a trajectory with some really dramatic stories in it. He's been imprisoned at least 4 times, had to go on the run for 6 years in Turkey, and yet throughout it continued to teach this positive action, mushbat harakat, consistent positive action on behalf of practicing Islam. And so the 5 topics that are at the heart of the book highlight 5 aspects, 5 what I call seeds of peace that Mr. Gulen has inspired other individuals to put into practice. The first one is learning. And in that chapter, chapter 1, I trace his life of learning and then his contribution, his philosophy and theology of learning that he has communicated to people inspired by him. Second chapter focuses on the non-violent practices at the heart of Islam, such as prayer. Prayer does extraordinary things. Neuroscientists are even finding to bring inner peace and then also to contribute to social peace, as do the other 5 pillars of Islam that Mr. Gulen has been teaching about throughout his life and that are practiced by people inspired by him. Third chapter focuses on what I call engaged empathy as a seed of peace. That is, deep feeling for the suffering of the world, the unnecessary suffering, and then a commitment to engage to do something positive about it as well, especially through constructive social action. Fourth chapter, principled pluralism, focuses on the Turkish conception of hoşgörü, which literally gets translated as tolerance, but it's a terrible translation because hoşgörü literally means to see nicely. It's a compound word in Turkish. As Mr. Gulen has inspired people to put it into practice, this dialogue, it means to see others as God sees them. And that means essentially to see others with eyes of mercy and compassion. And the final chapter covers the years from 1999 to the present and focuses on the work of people of Hizmet in social enterprises, that is, in developing businesses that generate wealth to help alleviate the central problems facing the modern world, of which there are 3. Those 3 central problems are ignorance, poverty, and disunity or violence. And those 3 problems are solved through generating businesses that create wealth, but that wealth that then gets used to address these 3 problems of ignorance, poverty, and disunity or violence through the platforms of the Hizmet movement around the globe. So In brief, that's the outline of the book and its contents, why I wrote it. My entire career since my doctorate at the University of Chicago has been spent studying the intersection between religions and violence and religions and peace building. The book I completed prior to this one is called Empire of Sacrifice, The Religious Origins of American Violence, and it looks at the role that religions have played in legitimizing and producing violence in American history, especially along the lines of age, race, and gender. And so I was looking for a happier topic, honestly. And I began doing research on peace builders, religious peace builders in history, and discovered they're an extraordinary thing. I believe the most significant story in the history of religions in the 20th century and early 21st century is the emergence of religious peace building as an effective catalyst for constructive social change in societies, basically from Gandhi to Gulen. And as I became familiar with people of Hizmet by attending dialogue events, by speaking at conferences, and so forth, I began to see how Mr. Gulen's place in history was very much in continuity with these religious peace builders, such as Gandhi, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Liberian Nobel laureate Lima Bowie, and as I studied more and more Mr. Gulen's life, the importance of that story of Mr. Gulen as a peace builder in that model became increasingly urgent as things went south in Turkey, as Erdogan consolidated his grip and clearly utilized the democratic facade to reinforce dictatorial actions that have had a profound and tragic consequence both for Turkey and for the globe. So that's why I wrote the book. I had to get it out. I wish it would have been out a couple of years earlier to help perhaps forestall some of the lies and propaganda that have circulated about Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet and the damage that has been done to them as a result of Erdogan's power grab.
Those are very powerful themes, I know, from his life. I wonder if you could share briefly at the height of the movement's impact in the world. What were people in the Gulen movement doing in Turkey and around the world?
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story in the history of religions, actually, how this movement, this community, Jemaat, how this community became missionary, not in a bad sense, not in a colonializing sense, but in the sense of commitment to carrying the positive action, the Musbet Harakat, all around the globe. So when I started doing the research for this book in 2008 and 2010, those were the first two big trips I took. The movement had established far and away the best schools in Turkey, from kindergarten, preschool, all the way up through colleges. And this was part of Mr. Gulen's emphasis on education as the path to solving ignorance. This social enterprise or social entrepreneurial focus on education as the crucial element, beginning with the school in Izmir, Yamanlar, and then schools all over Turkey. And in the early 1980s, as the Soviet Empire was falling apart, crumbling, people inspired by Mr. Gulen began to go to those former Soviet republics and establishing schools, especially in the Turkic-speaking communities there, but eventually all over in the former Soviet republics. And then in the 1990s, expanding globally. So to especially South Africa and Southern African nations, but eventually West Africa and East Africa as well. Similarly in Europe and in the United States, Australia, truly an extraordinary movement focused on education. That is, building schools, especially math and science academies, because one of Mr. Gulen's central premises is that we have to fly with two wings. And what he means by that is that there is no conflict between science and spirituality. Those are two wings of humanity provided by God for us to understand the world and to relate constructively to each other. So holding together science and spirituality as different modes of truth for people in the world. The second thing that followed from this emphasis on education as Hizmet, which means service, around the world as it grew, was the focus on generating wealth. Himet for Hizmet, that is, fundraising for Hizmet, for service, so that Turkish business leaders and academics and journalists and others started forming these organizations focused on generating wealth, and extraordinary resources eventually came to be associated with the Hizmet community. All of it voluntarily engaged, no central organizing structure, but lots of communities around Turkey and around the globe who were committed to this work, to Hizmet, and who were able to then mobilize considerable resources on behalf of solving the problems of ignorance and poverty. One of the best examples of this would be the media enterprises associated with the Hizmet movement, Samanyolu TV and Zaman newspaper, which grew from over the course of 20 years from a tiny startup newspaper, Zaman meaning time in English, to becoming a newspaper with a circulation of over 1 million, the largest single circulating newspaper in Turkey. And that's just an example of the kind of initiative that emerged and that grew to be a dynamic vehicle for excellent, objective, sort of center-right journalism. Think, kind of like the Wall Street Journal in the United States, if you want an analogy, and with that kind of circulation as well. And of course, has been completely shut down now by the current regime. And the third emphasis then within Hizmet is on dialogue, on big dialogue events, on academic conferences, bringing diverse people together for this hoşgörü, to learn how to live together, to put into practice what the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs called the dignity of difference, how we can live with each other through the dignity of difference. And people of Hizmet were on the front lines of interreligious dialogue in Turkey, doing things that had been taboo, even connecting with the Christian and the Muslim community, with the Jewish community in Turkey. I mean, way out in front of where the general Turkish society was, and certainly where the current president was and is at the time. So those three initiatives, focusing on education, on dialogue and social enterprise, were and are the heart of Hizmet at its height, with a center in Turkey and then satellites, throughout the globe. 135 different countries, I think, at one.
Yes, in my understanding, I think it's important for people outside the movement to know that these schools were secular in character, though informed by Islamic values. There was no overt religious teaching that happened, and primarily focused on math and science. That all the social services that ended up being provided in hospitals and social service agencies around the world, also, though an expression of hospitality and generosity out of an Islamic framework, again, came with no strings attached. And the emergence of the media might get us into another important point I'd like for you to address. And that is, if I could make a generalization in the world, there are basically two ways in which Islam interacts with the broader society, either overtly politically or from civil society. And the Hizmet movement had, in my understanding, no aspirations to formal political power. That any ways in which it interacted with the broader society, for instance, through the media, was always from a civil society perspective. And yet, somehow, that was a threat to the political structure in Turkey. Could you speak to that as maybe helping others understand how it was that we got to the purge?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dirk. And the political context in Turkey is tricky for U.S. citizens to understand. In that, right, if we imagine, Turkey at present with, three large factions. One, it's far more complex than that, of course, but what has emerged in Turkey would be the secularists. That is, the old line Ataturk secularists for whom religion is the problem. And religion is fine as long as it's private. But and as long as it's beholden to the secularist project of building this state, right? And as religion is run through an agency, a bureau. In Turkey, the Presidency of Religious Affairs, sends out the sermon for every Friday, and preachers follow along. And so that's the second group then would be the political Islamists, those who imagine, right, Islam as the glue that holds Turkey together, in opposition to the glue of the civil religion or the civil state of Ataturk, and especially the military as the guardian of that. So you have these kind of two ways in Turkey that have always been struggling and contending with, for most of the history of modern Turkey, or the Republic of Turkey, with the military on the top and Islam, operating privately below, but with political aspirations among some leaders that would then get squashed in a coup. The third faction that has emerged, that Hizmet really represented, was a civil Islam. That is, where this conflict between the secularists and the Islamists is bridged through participation in civil society. And that means in economic life, and as individuals in political life. Mr. Gulen has been very clear. He has never supported a candidate, never supported a party. And the same is true of the Hizmet community. If you understand Mr. Gulen and Hizmet politically, you misunderstand them, because their aspiration is to be faithful Muslims as individuals, to pray and to learn the practices of nonviolence that are, produce this deep peace, as I call it, both for individuals and in communities. It's remarkable. But then also to contribute to civil society as educators, as business leaders, as journalists, as baklava bakers. The whole range of society that is constructive. And that's really a third way within the history of Turkey that became attractive to individuals, especially who had not been part of the secularist elite to start with, or who weren't part of the political Islamist elite. And so you had this third way emerging that especially threatened or appeared to threaten the patronage and the overt economic benefits that came from being associated with one of these other forms, the secularist or the political Islamist sort of cohorts. And in that sense, Hizmet, people inspired by Mr. Gulen, became a perfect scapegoat to unite these other two groups, the political Islamists and the secularists, in a tense and fragile unity over and against people of Hizmet. And this is a pattern that recurs repeatedly in history, is that people solidify political power and force through the cultural practice of identifying a scapegoat and then taking what could be the rivalry of all against all and turning it into the solidarity of all against one. And it seems to me that is a diagnosis. You're following the theory of René Girard, a scholar of religion and violence, especially, also late scholar. But I think that illuminates a great deal about what has happened within Turkey. So Erdogan has united the secularists and the political Islamists by generating a scapegoat against whom he has vented horrific damage on individuals, on business and economic life in Turkey, on communities and families. It's really been tragic what has occurred since the coup, or the failed coup, or the staged coup.
Yes, it's been my experience, having the privilege of traveling around the world, seeing Hizmet at work on every continent, that these teachers and business people, these people working in social services, but just people as citizens, really operating from civil society and not wanting to take overt political stance. And yet somehow the movement has became a threat to the political structures. And if you could just say a bit now, Jon Pahl, about the current purge and the impact that it's had on people's lives, on institutions in Turkey.
Yeah, it is a tragic situation, Dirk, that the current regime, the Erdogan regime, which is essentially, a sort of kleptocratic model, has put people in prison. So hundreds of political prisoners now in Turkey, has persecuted individuals who are even vaguely associated with Mr. Gulen on the most specious arguments, and taken away their passports and made it impossible for them to gain a livelihood by firing them. Hundreds of thousands of people fired from jobs in the academy and other workforce locations. And they've policed speech. So political prisoners, persecution, and the policing of speech, which of course is, the truest mark of a dictatorial regime, is when that first amendment to the U.S. Constitution, that first liberty to speak freely and to organize various forms of media to communicate the truth, is silenced. And 187 different media outlets closed. Imagine in the United States if the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe were gone. And we were left with Fox News, not even Fox News. Because 90% of the current media circulating in Turkey, and the television stations as well, NBC, ABC, CBS, gone. Fox News. That's the policing of speech that has occurred in Turkey that has led to an incredible brain drain in the country. Extraordinary hardship in the lives of individuals who have had to flee, who are in prison unjustly, but with profound long-term consequences for Turkish society. There was a reason Barack Obama made Turkey his first official state visit in 2008. Because of the extraordinary hope at that time for Turkey's participation as a 97% Muslim nation, at least nominally, the participation of Turkey in the European Union. and bridging in this way Europe and the Middle East. It was an extraordinary hope, and the people of Hizmet would have been an extraordinary bridge in this way. And now what has happened is people have had to flee the country if they have the means and resources to do that. And there are some extraordinary stories of both heroism and adventure and tragedy in that situation of refugee status, basically, and then relocation and starting life anew all over the world, in Canada, in Northern Europe, in Australia, in East and West Africa, South Africa, and in the United States to a lesser degree. And we can hope and pray that under a new administration, and greater openness to refugees and people who have to flee a country for political reasons, and will be reopening. Give me your tired, your poor, as Emma Lazarus put it. So the Purge has been a tragic development, truly profound consequences for individuals, families, Turkish community, and for the world of peace building. But here's the thing, and my hope. This is not the first time Mr. Gulen has faced persecution. It is not the first time people of Hizmet have run into obstacles. And I trace in the biography how every time there's been an obstacle like this in the past, Mr. Gulen and people of Hizmet emerge stronger from it. Because they don't hit back. They don't react, but just continue with this patient, positive, musbet hareket, positive action, living out the principles of their faith and gaining the secular knowledge, the self-critical awareness of themselves as individuals, as citizens, and as faithful Muslims. And it is my hope that in Belgium, in Great Britain, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in Nigeria, South Africa, these peace islands will continue to grow the work of Hizmet and have a profound positive effect on the communities where they have now landed in diaspora. So that's my hope.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of the movement for this important contribution, the first definitive critical autobiography, for this deep understanding that you have about Hizmet. And I believe it will help bridge the gap with those who are just coming to understand what is happening in Turkey, what it means to these really courageous, altruistic people. And so for that contribution, I want to thank you.
It was a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for your contributions as well. Look forward to working with you in the future, inshallah.